welcome to all of you. I'm Christian Laas, and I will be the moderator of this session, which will be held by Professor Olivia Milburn. What to say? In 2015, I started having plans about a book, a sort of comparative volume about disabilities in the ancient world. And I was looking for one scholar who could possibly do disabilities in ancient China. A colleague whose name now lives in our memory, Dr. Miles, suggested me the name of a certain Olivia Milburn, whom I had never met before. I just wrote an email to Olivia. I almost immediately got my reply, and imagine she was the very first to send her chapter to me, and it was, or it is, a brilliant chapter, still a real joy to read. So I'm very happy to introduce Professor Olivia Milburn, now from Seoul National University, educated in Oxford, Cambridge, and London, coming from a very multilingual and multicultural background, a prolific author, and a famous translator also of Chinese into English. And Olivia will talk today about records of brain damage in early and medieval China. I'm pleased to give her the floor.
Well, thank you very much, Christian, and also thank you very much to Avital for inviting me to participate in this conference. Right, so my topic today is records of brain damage from early and medieval China. And to begin with, I am going to start with looking at a quotation from the original script for The Madness of King George by Alan Bennett, where this did not make it into the final film, but he wrote this dialogue for two of his characters to discuss the problems of King George III, who was suffering from porphyria, a metabolic disease which can make the sufferer appear insane. So the king appeared in many ways to be a lunatic, but in fact he was physically affected by his condition. So this brief conversation points to one of the key problems in understanding brain damage, that until you have effective brain imaging technology, which does not happen until late 20th century, any kind of analysis raises difficult questions concerning the difference between insanity caused by chemical imbalances in the brain, emotional trauma, and similar to identical symptoms which are caused by physical damage. So in early and medieval China, as in many other cultures, there was a large but generally quite imprecise vocabulary to talk about brain damage, because it was impossible to separate issues caused by brain lesions, which might be the result of either disease or injury, from those resulting from other causes. So the one exception to this is the term quant, which is going to be the focus of my paper. Quant has been extensively studied for medical texts, but the use of this term in non-medical literature has been comparatively neglected. Quant is often used specifically to denote acquired brain injuries and dementia, that is, mental problems derived from known or suspected causes resulting in personality or behavioral change in adults. Many causes of quant were well known in antiquity, including heavy metal and neurotoxin poisoning, diseases like rabies, strokes, concussion, head injuries, alcohol abuse. In other instances, you have quant-like symptoms from unknown causes, and they are discussed in those terms. So the victims of these disorders developed a hidden impairment, but one which could be devastating to quality of life. The full impact of brain lesions on human health is only just beginning to be appreciated, with advanced scanning technologies allowing medical researchers to track the impact of this kind of damage. Writings about insanity and dementia in the modern era are fundamentally different from those which were produced in early and medieval China. First of all, mental health was usually understood as a dynamic state, so the focus is on a changing and developing situation. Secondly, attention is almost exclusively directed towards the effects of such conditions on the family and friends of the person afflicted, and then on the wider community and society as a whole. This gives an externalized image of mental health issues, and it means that mild conditions with manifestations that don't have a significant negative impact on other people tend not to be documented. This stands in marked contrast to modern perspectives, which focus on the experiences of the individual concerned, regardless of whether anybody else is affected or not. As a result of this kind of nay-why presentation of symptoms, it can be very difficult to match ancient accounts with modern diagnosis. So I'm going to be concentrating mainly on the handful of cases where you have a condition described in sufficient detail to be quite sure that brain lesions are the only known cause of these manifestations, or where the brain injury is, the cause is known and it is explicitly referenced. So early dictionary definitions of quant associate this character with rabies, which is an inflammation of the brain caused by lysoviruses. This usage suggests that quant would carry connotations of acquired rather than congenital brain damage, while quant is often used in quite a general and vague sense to denote madness. There are also quite a lot of instances that show a more specific meaning was intended by authors of early and medieval texts. The connection between being bitten by a rabid animal and developing rabies oneself was clearly understood in early China. The earliest reference to a rabid dog is this one from Lord Juan, which describes such an animal entering the mansion of hereditary minister Huachen in the capital city in Song in the year 556. Although on this occasion, thankfully, nobody was bitten, the event was understood as an omen of coming misfortune that persuaded Huachen that he ought to leave the country. The strong association of quant with mental health problems acquired in adulthood goes right back to the very earliest references to this term in Chinese literature. In the first lunar month of 707, after a reign of 38 years, Lord Juan of Chern became demented and left his residence unnoted, only to be found dead 16 days later. Unable to determine exactly when his lordship died, the date of his disappearance and of the discovery of his body were announced by the authorities in Chern, and then this discrepancy is discussed in a number of ancient Chinese texts. Lord Juan's dementia was a personal tragedy, but the fact that he wandered off and died was a disaster for the country. The prolonged political instability caused by Lord Juan's mental deterioration ultimately resulted in much suffering for the people of Chern. When this case is considered in Baihutung, it was in the context of a wider debate about the circumstances in which a ruler could be demoted. So the physical and acquired nature of quant is stressed in this account. The commentary given here hints at the difficulties of dismissing a ruler from their position, regardless of the physical or mental disabilities they suffered from. Lord Juan of Chen, who seems to have been a perfectly effective ruler until his mind was destroyed by dementia, was apparently overtaken by his problems quite suddenly. At least that was the understanding of the Han Dynasty scholars commenting on this tale. For those in power, becoming demented as a result of accident or disease would pose an enormous challenge for everyone around them. All too often, we have these accounts of conditions which survive precisely because they concern those who were in a position to ruin the lives of those around them. Their political significance means that they were documented in text that survive to the present day. And the physicality of quant can be seen in many early sources. So, for example, Jin Gui Yao Lue discusses the terrible effects of alkaloid poisoning in terms of quant. So, Shui Landang is only known from this one text. We don't know what plant this is, but it is a member of the Solanaceae family. And these plants are very poisonous. You have symptoms such as hallucinations, memory loss, confusion, seizures, coma, when the toxins damage the brain. In this text, since the focus is on the cause of the condition, the behavioral and physical changes that result from eating poisonous leaves are clearly articulated, even though the precise nature of the injuries inflicted by these alkaloids would not be understood until modern times. Early and medieval accounts often stress that people suffering from quant were experiencing an abnormal change. But the vast majority of references to this state give no indication as to the cause. So it's unclear often whether the person is suffering something like a psychotic break or the effect of brain damage. For example, Han Shu speaks of the tragic case of Zhang Yao, whose aggressive anger expended itself in blaming other people for his own behavior in terms that brought about the deaths of many people. Here, the personality change experienced by Zhang Yao is explicitly referenced, even though the cause is unknown. So this translation is following the commentary by Yan Shigu, who states that a person experiencing quang yi has changed, has become demented. In this instance, Zhang Yao's acquired mental problems took the form of anger issues. While this does not in any way change interpretations of the original text, thinking of quang yi as possibly representing a manifestation of brain damage focuses attention on the way in which a known mental health problem could be manipulated by others, by those in power, as an excuse to torment and destroy people. So, my first case study is concerned with Othello syndrome. So, descriptions of sexual jealousy appear in Chinese literature during the course of the Han Dynasty. And then from the early medieval period onward, there are also clear accounts of morbid and pathological jealousy. This is also known as Othello syndrome. Individuals suffering from morbid jealousy are preoccupied with the belief that their partner is unfaithful, citing innocuous interactions as evidence of an affair, and they react with high levels of violence against the supposedly guilty person. Morbid jealousy needs to be distinguished from other pathologies. So delusional jealousy is a form of paranoia, which focuses on infidelity, but this would be accompanied by other kinds of imaginary victimizations. And obsessional jealousy is a form of unwanted thinking, where the person concerned is aware that their suspicions are unfounded, but they cannot control the intrusive thoughts on this subject. The level of derangement seen among sufferers of morbid jealousy is typified by one of the earliest described cases studied by Dr. Alzheimer of Alzheimer's disease fame. And his female patient was tormented by intense suspicions about her spouse and manifested violent behaviors at the idea he was unfaithful. But this was happening at a time when her neural pathways had deteriorated so badly that in real life she could no longer recognize her husband. Current research indicates that morbid jealousy is symptomatic of brain damage, and in particular, it is strongly associated with repeated traumatic brain injuries, particularly from certain kinds of sports. Boxers, rugby players, football players are very prone to this kind of condition and Alzheimer's disease. And this is incurable. This very violent, unreasoning form of jealousy does not have any other known cause. This is a manifestation of brain damage. So there is one fantastic example of morbid jealousy of this kind being described in Du Fuji, the earliest surviving text about jealousy. So Du Fuji was compiled by Yu Tongzhi at the order of Emperor Ming of Song Dynasty, Liu-Song Dynasty, supposedly for the edification of imperial princesses, but I am not sure what they were supposed to learn from this. And although this text does not survive in its entirety, there are a number of tales from it which are preserved in later medieval compilations. Some of these stories are concerned with very famous historical individuals. Others, like this one, involve individuals at a lower social level. These people are not recorded elsewhere. The account of the Shun Yu marriage records the impact of a wife's morbid jealousy on the family and the community as a whole. And it is possible this is fictional or fictionalized. However, as the common name for pathological jealousy suggests, Othello syndrome, some classic accounts of this condition are found in literary representations. So the opening of this story stresses the disarrangement in the household caused by the wife's morbid jealousy. She does not obey gender norms. She does not accept sexual segregation. She reacts with murderous violence at any action that she feels threatens her relationship with her husband. The disassociation between the extreme levels of emotion expressed by Lady Yu and the actions that are triggering her, so her husband's passing contact with friends, servants making deliveries, this is very marked and characteristic of this condition. So having described the brutal treatment meted out to others by Lady Yu, the next section of the text talks about the way that other people respond to her. Since her attacks were aimed at anyone who visits the house and behaved in a way that she found provocative, it was impossible to keep people from being affected by her mental deterioration. Unfortunately, the way that the community reacted was through further abuse. As can be seen from the conversation with a witness to this marriage, Mr. Xun describes his wife as demented. And he says quant, and it is likely that he intended to indicate personality change on her part. It is not at all clear what might have caused his wife's morbid jealousy, but her behavior is entirely consistent with this being some kind of brain injury. This is not obsessional or delusional jealousy. The conclusion of this story contains a rare reference to the feelings of the person concerned when forced to confront the consequences of her action. But the overall focus of this account is on the experiences and impact on family and friends. It is worth noting that Lady Yu has good reason to be frightened at this point. Although medieval legal statutes do not survive, there are a number of references in historical texts that show just how seriously attacks on people's heads and faces were taken. These strongly suggest that assaults which mark the face were regarded as attempted murder. There are a number of documented instances where elite men and women were executed for wounding another person's head. So Lady Yu was protected from the worst possible consequences of her action only by her family's decision to deal with this privately. However, given that her problem is one involving brain damage, it is extremely unfortunate that the response of those around her is to start beating her themselves, which, as this account makes clear, does not ameliorate the situation in the slightest. So these people are locked in a vicious circle that will end only with death. The second case study, Korsakoff syndrome. So at present, researchers are divided on whether brain damage is caused directly by drinking alcohol in excess, or whether alcoholism results in nutritional deficiencies that produce brain damage. Whichever is the case, alcoholism in some individuals will result in them developing permanent brain damage with personality and behavioral changes. There are extensive accounts of alcoholism in Chinese literature and a wide terminology to describe alcohol abuse. So there are a number of references in early and medieval Chinese texts to alcoholics who have been driven demented by their addiction and the dangers that this poses to those around them. The classic account of this kind of problem alcoholic concerns an individual named Guanfu. His fate was of little interest to others. The important result of his action was the death of Dou Ying, an innocent bystander in all the quarreling and fighting provoked by Guanfu. Han Dynasty accounts suggest that this particular case hit a nerve because Guanfu's misbehavior created an opportunity for Empress Dowager Wang Zhi, second wife of Emperor Ji of Han Dynasty, to eliminate her mother-in-law's family. Though the proximate cause of this disaster was the scene Guanfu caused at the wedding of Qianfen, Dowager Empress Wang Zhi's younger half-brother, Dou Ying would not have been executed for bringing along a deranged alcoholic, were it not for his blood relationship with the late Grand Empress Dowager Dou. So this account from Fai and Julin is presented in the context of karmic debts. Having inflicted unjustified punishment upon Doying, Qianfen was struck down by disease a few months later and died kowtowing and begging for mercy from the spirits of his victims. Guanfu is one of the very earliest problem alcoholics to appear in the literary record in China, but he is certainly not the last. In this account, he is said to have been driven demented by alcohol. He is, it's Guangzhou, which suggests an extremely high degree of damage. Accounts of alcoholism do not normally include the term quant. Exactly the same word is used in Beishi to describe Emperor Wenshen of the Northern Qi, and this expression occurs in an account of the circumstances in which Grand Consort Arju died. These events are obviously very disturbing, although presented here in bald terms. Grand Consort Arju was Emperor Wenshen's stepmother and a Buddhist nun. So while the Northern Qi imperial house does seem to have followed the custom of levirate marriage, that this is a non-consensual and sacrilegious act. In the annals of Emperor Wenshen, preserved in Beiqi Shu, a fuller account of Emperor Wenshen's behavior makes it clear that he was doing some very disturbing things in the last 4 years of his life, and his attack on his stepmother, which ended in her death, was not at all out of character. This famous description of Emperor Wenshen's mental decay has already been studied by a number of people, and everybody agrees that his problems go far beyond alcohol abuse. What is key is this line from his official biography, which states explicitly that Emperor Wenshen was an alcoholic who had stopped eating. That means that he is going to be suffering from Korsakoff syndrome, which is a form of brain damage caused by malnutrition, which is common among and almost unique to alcoholics who have stopped eating because their entire calorie intake comes from alcohol. While it is possible that Emperor Wenshen was also suffering from some other kind of neurodegenerative condition, his bizarre behavior can be fully explained by a combination of 3 factors. First, he's an emperor. He has the power of life and death over his subjects. Second, the highly abusive nature of so many members of the Gao family and the violent society in which they lived. And then Korsakoff syndrome, thirdly, which is characterized by serious cognitive impairment. The Beiqi Shu biography of Emperor Wenshen provides a fascinating and detailed account of His Majesty's descent into dementia through relentless drinking, which begins with an account of his bizarre and antisocial behavior. From at least the time of the Han Dynasty, medical texts associated quant with becoming extremely noisy and disrupted sleeping patterns. An unwillingness to wear clothing is also commonly described as a feature of quant. Appearing in public with a bare chest would have been deeply shocking in an emperor, and it seems that Emperor Wenshen sometimes wore no clothing at all. These behaviors, combined with violence, sexual exhibitionism, and refusal to sleep, must have been a great source of distress and concern for those around the emperor. On the other hand, for a contemporary audience, wanting to wear makeup is not problematic. Elite men in the medieval period were habitual users of cosmetics, but using the term tufu, he daubed himself. yeah, that does suggest a disturbing quality. The account of Emperor Wenshen's behavior in his last years, having talked about sexual exhibitionism and so on, moves on to violence. And the author of Beiqi Shu says that he killed countless people, and continues with naming some of the emperor's distinguished victims, members of the court who died because of his delusions. The emperor's own mother suffered violence when he injured her by overturning the couch on which she was reclining, and he is also known to have killed a number of his junior consorts. Since Emperor Wenshen was an alcoholic who had stopped eating, he must have been suffering from Korsakoff syndrome. In contemporary medicine, you can do something to mitigate this with vitamin injections, but that only staves off the worst of the brain damage inflicted by alcohol-induced malnutrition. Two of the major symptoms of Korsakoff syndrome are amnesia and confabulation, where alcoholic blackouts and brain damage result in periods where the person is either unconscious or unable to remember what has happened. And then they themselves are unaware of this because the gap in consciousness is filled by invented memories. This can cause a great deal of trouble and distress because the alcoholic individual may subsequently act in accordance with these invented memories, and both minor distortions and major fantasies, that is florid confabulation, have been recorded among Korsakoff syndrome patients. Korsakoff syndrome therefore normally requires an internal and an external perspective in order to identify that false memories are being created. But the emphasis in early and medieval Chinese texts is on the effects of mental illness upon others. As a result, it is not surprising that Emperor Wenshen's personal experiences are seen as largely irrelevant. However, it is possible that these references to seeing all manner of ghosts and hearing strange noises is an attempt by a baffled chronicler to describe the results of an extreme example of florid confabulation. The Beiqi Shu biography concludes with a description of the change that occurred in the government of the country as a direct result of the emperor's alcoholism, as a strong and effective monarch had his mind destroyed by his drinking problem. There's every reason to believe this is an accurate account, since a wide variety of historical records strongly suggest that it is only in the last 4 years of his life that Emperor Wenshen descended into dementia. This account also stresses another aspect of the situation, the burden imposed by the unreasonable demands and financial profligacy of the emperor, which would make life intolerable for all of his subjects, no matter how remote from the throne. The account of Emperor Wenshen's alcoholism is exceptionally detailed and well preserved, thanks to the fact that his position as a monarch ensured his actions would affect his subjects in a direct and personal way. This Northern Qi dynasty emperor seems to have been particularly badly affected by his condition, which caused him to engage in violent and deranged behavior through the last years of his life. The combination of Korsakoff syndrome and the power of life and death means that Emperor Wenshen's example offers a compelling case study of the way in which one person's brain damage can affect the nation as a whole. Researching brain damage presents challenges that are not found in understanding other aspects of the treatment of the disabled and physically impaired in early and medieval China. In most instances, the condition that is impacting people's lives is documented. And so you can kind of move directly onto thinking about the wider implications of the subject, the treatment that is being meted out to the blind, the deaf, the disabled, and so on, the cultural attitudes embodied in the way that they are represented. Brain damage cannot be studied in this way because many of the manifestations of this condition have only come to be understood very recently. In early and medieval China, either these people would have been thought to be mad and described that way, or in the case of unproblematized manifestations of brain injury, they might have been considered difficult or eccentric personalities, but this is very unlikely to have been documented. It's really only in the cases where the persons concerned were sufficiently prominent or did sufficiently extreme damage to other people that they are documented. And then the most significant term used to talk about their experiences is quant. Research into brain damage has only just begun, as modern medicine continues to demonstrate that various syndromes previously regarded as psychological are in fact the result of organic injury. Historical and literary records in China will need to be combed to construct the history of these conditions. This work will serve a number of purposes. First, to better understand the social attitudes displayed towards people with invisible impairments throughout Chinese history. Secondly, to provide a new insight into historical events and the biographies of people suffering from the effects of brain injury. Third, to explore the verisimilitude or otherwise of literary representations of these conditions. And finally, to provide a counterweight to those people who continue to argue that risk of brain damage is no reason to change traditional cultural practices. Thank you.
Well, you already see the virtual applause coming, Olivia. Thank you so much. I think this was fascinating, this was brilliant, and this was such rich material also that was presented to us, always in a nice way and with very concrete fragments that really give us the impression that we somehow reach out to these people in the faraway past. Okay, I think that we have at least 10 minutes for some questions. So I'm very glad to open the discussion. I think you should, or you could just use the raise your hand function, or also just send questions by chat, whatever you want. Who would like to start?
Okay, I think I'll just introduce myself directly. Thank you for the talk. It was really interesting. I have a question about the interpretation of these passages that you found. Excuse me. So while I have no doubt that quant in the medical literature probably means something along the lines of what you presented, I was wondering about the interpretation of the other passages, in particular that about jealousy. If jealousy is by and large attached to women, I wonder how whether this idea that they're damaged, right, is a way to portray them very, very heavily, and the people that are being portrayed are people who don't conform. In this case, the case you presented was a woman who didn't conform to social rules, and you mentioned yourself at one point that the effect of mental illnesses is highlighted because of what it means for others. So I wonder if that, in that sense, this use of someone who is not being well is actually a very, very extreme use of what is a medical term, but is not really indicating that there is a brain damage there. In the same way, we use language today and terms like deranged or insane very often to talk about people when in fact they're not deranged or insane from a medical perspective, right? So I was wondering if there's also a lot of that going on in choosing that a vocabulary that is medical in origin, or can be used in a medical sphere. Yeah.
Yes, right. Yeah, jealousy, of course, you are quite right, is difficult because this has traditionally been associated with women, and that this is regarded as a problem which women are particularly prone to. And I, in fact, came across this description of Lady Yu when I was researching jealousy and the history of this particular emotion, because there's actually quite a major shift in understandings of jealousy, early imperial era to age of disunion. So in early imperial times, you see jealous women and you also see not jealous women. It's binary. And then once you move into age of disunion time, certainly after the fall of Han Dynasty, you start to see people talking about jealousy as a spectrum. So you have all women are jealous, and everybody seems to agree this. All women are jealous. It's just a question of degree and how much they are prepared to hide this. And so the store or fit in with other people and whatever, but basically there's this idea that it's a spectrum. And then the case with Lady Yu becomes very interesting because this is coming out at a time when jealousy has been completely reinterpreted and basically all women are jealous. But Lady Yu is jealous in a strange and extreme way. And the fact is that you have this very odd description of behavior and actions which are so extreme that it is shocking and it is distressing. And I think this is not part of the normal discourse about jealousy.
Okay, thank you. So sorry, one very curious, very quick, just out of curiosity, do we know who's doing the description of Lady Yu, for example?
No.
Okay.
No, this is not known, and don't know who wrote any of these stories. They're compiled by Yu Tongzhi, but whether he wrote them or not, nobody knows.
Okay, thank you so much. These were very relevant and most intriguing questions too. Other questions? Sorry, I just see one in the chat, which you can all see too, by Albert Galvani. Thanks a lot for your lecture, Olivia. It was very interesting. I would like to ask you about the role of demons in Zhuangzi, given the relevance of some well-known episode included in this text. Do you think these passages could be read as an attempt not only to criticize political assumptions behind normality, but also to modify the social attitude towards mental impairment of the time?
Yes, yeah, sure. No, absolutely. Zhuangzi is of course really interesting because he does have all of these disabled, impaired characters, and they are there to be challenging. So I absolutely agree with you. It is challenging to normality, and it is challenging to your assumptions. Yes.
Okay, I think that, thank you so much. I think that Tobias Dürn indicated by chat that he had a question.
Yeah, hi Olivia,
Yeah.
Thanks for your talk. I have a question for you. So I'm teaching a class right now myself on categories, and in my case, it's the categories of religion and philosophy, and the way how such importations of categories can cause some problems. And I have a question for you. So, right, when we assume that there are different medical communities in the world throughout history, where perhaps the modern day vocabulary is not necessarily easily matched on the other communities' ways of how they were thinking, and how perhaps in the ways how these communities were making sense of what we would nowadays call brain damage through other social means oftentimes. So, I mean, one of the things, for example, I've seen is a lot of stuff that you were describing would also be fit into religious context, very clearly that you didn't mention as a kind of a framework to explain in some sense how quant and other terms are described here. So my question to you then is basically, what kind of benefits and dangers do you see by mapping the category of brain damage on a category like quant or quant-E? Do you see any positive and negative side effects of this kind of paralleling of these categories?
Well, I mean, the obvious negative is it doesn't help us understand anything. So just trying to map the brain damage and quant-E together it doesn't necessarily bring anything forward. It doesn't change our understanding of what is going on here. It doesn't develop anything. It's just, here is a possible way to, bring two categories together. And that is, of course, concerning. Is this actually pointless? Or by thinking about brain damage, is it possible to move on from what is described in quant-E to actually think about historical events, historical personalities in a different way? And is it possible to use this as a tool to further understanding of what is actually going on in some of these texts? And at the moment, that's kind of debatable, because this process has really only just begun. And that's not just a problem in China. That's a problem with everybody and brain damage, because so many things are only very recently starting to be understood as brain damage rather than other kinds of insanity. So it's really hard at the moment to say this is going to be useful, that this is going to be an effective tool for understanding the past and thinking about what is happening here. Yeah, that of course is a really major concern, but that's not just, that's all accounts of brain damage from every society that have this problem, because this is all really new.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, both for the question and for the answer. Coming from a tradition, namely antiquity, where you have all these so-called mad emperors, I could only agree with what you said, Olivia. And it's intriguing to see that most of the questions so far always go back to either the issue of categories, vocabulary, or the problem of so-called retrospective diagnosis. So can we actually use what we know from medicine nowadays? Can we use it to apply this to ancient texts too, or is that just simply unbridgeable and impossible? Okay, I think we have room for at least one other question.
We have Mia Ting from raising hand.
Thank you. Yes. Okay. Thanks for the speech. It's fantastic. My question is, when you talk about the records of brain damage, I'm pretty sure you have thought of the cause of brain damage, right? There are all kinds of causes. And my recent attention was given to Ganbao's work during the Eastern Jin Dynasty, right? And I started my research with In Search of the Supernatural, and I noticed almost exclusively he would give the cause of various diseases given the cause to the encounter with something strange and supernatural. And what amazes me is when I go to his historical work, for example, some remains of Jingji, right, the records of the Jin Dynasty, and exclusively he would give the causes of various diseases also to the encounter with the supernatural or strange. I would not say supernatural because in these historical records, he would simply call it like encounter with the strange, something unknown. So my understanding is maybe during the Eastern Jin Dynasty, people usually would explain the cause of the various diseases as encounter with the strange, and later people started to develop their understanding of the cause of various diseases. So do you think there is a development from early China to medieval China? That's my question. Thank you.
Yes, very interesting point. But actually, I think this, so far as I can see, there isn't necessarily a clear progression here, because some things are talked about in quite a different way. So yes, you're quite right. You have the things to do with you know, the encounter with some kind of spirit or whatever. But on the other hand, strokes, you wouldn't see them being talked about in this way. Even when strokes inflict brain damage, they don't talk about it in this way. And certain kinds of poisoning, again, definitely not that, you know, you eat this poison and then you go very, very strange. And I found a really nice example where somebody was talking about taking cinnabar elixir thing and then suffering quant and you know, going insane from taking mercury. So clearly for some things, from a very, very early stage, the cause and effect is identified, and you don't see any kind of progression or development in these specific conditions. Yeah, I think it varies very much depending on who you are talking about and what kind of manifestation is going on.
Okay, thank you so much. Again, an interesting question, which comes down to the theme of continuity and change, of course. So I apologize that I did not see the raised hand, and I still see one very last raised hand now. So I think we can just do that very last question by Elizabeth Hu.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Sure, absolutely.
Coming so late to this conference, which Avital organized, but I was really interested in you talking about quant, Olivia. And I come, of course, from a background which is very careful about retrospective diagnosis, but I do agree that certain diseases have a gestalt which you can recognize across the ages and across place. So to insist that quant isn't rabies in the example you gave in the Schwowen would be just a bit strange. I agree. I was particularly interested in you saying there was a lot of alcoholism. Now, as you know, alcoholism is quite a specific disease, which was declared such in the 1956 by the American Association of Alcohol. But I was interested more in what are the semantics and what are the words which you found for such conditions where people have, you had here two quant.
Yes, yeah, the Guangzhou, that's unusual, and that definitely seems to be referring to some kind of very extreme things like Tanzhou, the kind of greed for alcohol, that's much more common, you know, the suggesting that you can't control your consumption.
Yeah, have you done an article on it, or have you done research on it? No.
Research, yes. Article, no. Not yet.
And is it wider, the semantic field? I mean, is there a wider amount of vocabulary? Tangible.
Yes, yeah, there's a quite considerable variation in vocabulary to do with demand for alcohol. Mm. You know, uncontrollable urge to drink. Yeah,
thank you.
Well, Elizabeth, thank you so much for this question. Having just finished an article on for the lemma Trunkenheit for the Reallexikon für Antike und Christentum, I'm also very much interested in this topic, Olivia. But it's for me almost 3 o'clock now, and I'm happy to read the remark by Avital you have all in the chat box now. All welcome to join us for the final session towards the history of disability in Chinese antiquity at 3 p.m. British time. That is 1 hour from now. I don't know whether Avital has anything to add to this right now.
Just to thank you for moderating the session so wonderfully, and to Olivia for tuning in despite the late time, and hoping to see you all for the round table where we'll discuss some lingering questions from.
It was a pleasure to chair this session and a pleasure to hear Olivia, and I think we should just give her a warm applause at the end of this session, either virtual or
hoping to an hour from now on the same link.
Okay.
Bye-bye.